The wind moved low and slow through the narrow streets of Indianapolis around the year 1908. It carried with it the brittle scent of coal smoke, mingling with the faint sweetness of bread cooling in a shop window, a reminder of the city's working-class rhythm. Snow pressed itself into the brick alleys, not soft but compacted by horse hooves and the leather boots of men moving to their factories at dawn. Against this backdrop walked a boy no one would notice, his breath showing itself in short white bursts, as if the winter air wanted to keep count of his steps. That boy was John Herbert Dillinger. Barely 5 years old, he was already learning that silence could be both comfort and shield. His shoes, second-hand and thin at the soles, whispered against the frost. His world was small, just a block of houses, the church steeple pointing skyward, and the quiet presence of his father, who believed discipline was the best gift a man could give a son. In those early mornings, when the street lamps were still burning pale circles into the frozen mist, John absorbed the character of his world. The city was not glamorous. It was not kind. The hum of machinery, the clatter of horse-drawn wagons, the low voices of men hardened by factory shifts, these were the lullabies of his childhood. Many people still think that notorious figures are born in moments of drama, shaped instantly by some fiery event. But more often, they are molded slowly in the spaces between silence and necessity. So, what do you think? Can a boy raised among shadows avoid becoming one himself? Let's anchor this with a historical fact. The early 20th century in Indiana was a time of contradiction. Indianapolis was industrializing, drawing workers into its mills, rail yards, and workshops. The automobile had begun to replace the horse, but in neighborhoods like the one Dillinger grew up in, the old and new coexisted uneasily. Families lived in modest clapboard houses, and while the city center hummed with commerce, the residential streets carried the weight of restraint. Men like Dillinger's father, a stern grocer, believed deeply in rules and order. For them, survival depended on work, not dreams. Punishment was considered a form of protection, and children were expected to learn obedience early. Law enforcement at the time was not what it would later become. Police patrols were inconsistent, relying on local authority figures and informal systems of trust. In such an environment, a boy with curiosity and restless energy could easily slip between the cracks of supervision. Dillinger's world was bounded by both the rigid morality of his father and the loose oversight of the city still finding its modern identity. He would grow up seeing both, the strict hand of authority and the soft spaces where authority seemed absent. That tension would leave its mark. There's a story that when John was a child, he was quieter than most, prone to watching rather than speaking. He lingered on the edges of conversations, eyes fixed on movements more than words. While other children played loudly in the streets, John sometimes withdrew, fascinated by how shadows stretched along walls at dusk or how a lock turned in his father's grocery store. It wasn't mischief yet, only observation. But in retrospect, those who knew him would later recall that he seemed to live slightly apart, as though his thoughts already belonged to another world. One winter evening, the sound of boots on packed snow echoed outside his home. His father had just finished closing the day's accounts at the store, tallying coins by lamplight. John watched him closely, seeing how carefully he lined up the figures, how he double-checked every entry, how he guarded each cent. For his father, money was not just currency. It was proof of control, evidence of order in a chaotic world. John felt the weight of that discipline. Yet something in him resisted it. When asked to sit still, he fidgeted. When told to wait, he found ways to wander. His father's sternness met his curiosity like iron against water, never truly blending, always testing one another. At school, the boy's restlessness showed more clearly. Teachers noticed his tendency to daydream, to stare out the window when lessons turned repetitive. He wasn't unintelligent, far from it. He learned quickly when engaged, but he lacked patience for rules that seemed arbitrary. The world outside a classroom called to him with its unscripted rhythm. He wanted movement, not stillness. He wanted the cold air on his face, the creak of wagon wheels, the smell of oil and iron rising from the factories. These things seemed more real than ink on a slate board. And so, the first small cracks appeared. The cracks were not yet crimes, only moments of misalignment with the structures around him. But history often begins with cracks before it widens into fractures. Many people still think that crime arrives like thunder, sudden and overwhelming. But more often, it creeps in like frost, spreading quietly, invisibly, until the surface is brittle enough to break with the lightest touch. Psychologically, John Dillinger's childhood speaks to a paradox many criminal figures share: the coexistence of discipline and defiance. His father's rigid structure taught him caution, but also instilled resentment. That resentment found expression not through open rebellion, at least not yet, but through small acts of withdrawal, through a growing hunger for freedom. He was a boy who both feared and needed authority, who both wanted approval and longed to escape it. In psychological terms, this tension can create what scholars call reactance, the instinctive urge to push against rules simply because they exist. There was also the shaping influence of his environment. Dillinger grew up in a community where working-class survival left little room for tenderness. Displays of vulnerability were discouraged. Men were expected to endure quietly, to keep their emotions hidden behind steady routines. For a sensitive and restless boy, this suppression could feel like suffocation. Observers later described him as charming, capable of warmth, but beneath that surface ran currents of insecurity, the kind born from early struggles to reconcile discipline with longing. So, what do you think? If a child learns that obedience is survival but silence is suffocating, where does he turn when the streets grow louder than the home? As this first chapter draws to its close, let us soften the light. Picture young John on a cold winter's night, lying in a narrow bed beneath a thin quilt, listening to the distant rumble of a train. The whistle rose into the sky, like a question no one could answer. The rhythm of its wheels faded into the distance, a lullaby of steel on steel. Outside, the snow fell again, muffling the world into silence. Inside, the boy's thoughts wandered, restless and unfinished, already searching for something beyond the walls of his small home. The streets of Indianapolis slept under a white veil, but the footsteps of its children still echoed faintly in the dark. John Dillinger was among them, a shadow in the making, his story just beginning. And as the night deepened, as the lamps burned low, the city itself seemed to exhale, inviting both dreamers and restless souls into sleep. Perhaps if you listen closely, you can still hear those footsteps, soft, hesitant, yet carrying the weight of a future no one could yet see. The years shifted gently, like the creak of an old door in winter, into 1910. Indianapolis was caught between the rhythm of tradition and the restless hum of modernity. For young John Dillinger, those years of early boyhood were turning into fragile outlines of adolescence. The winter still pressed heavily on the wooden porches of his neighborhood, frost spreading its delicate patterns across window glass. But a boy who once watched quietly from doorsteps now carried a sharper look in his eyes. Observers recalled that there was something in his gaze, not anger exactly, not rebellion in its loudest form, but a kind of hunger, a curiosity that could not be satisfied by lessons, nor by sermons, nor by the strict lines of his father's household. The soundscape of his childhood remained familiar. The hiss of coal in the stove, the groan of wagon wheels against packed snow, the muffled laughter of children running through alleys before supper. Yet John often stood apart, hands in pockets, watching more than joining. There's a story that his neighbors would sometimes find him loitering near the edge of a streetlight's glow, not fully hidden, not fully present. Just there, staring as though trying to see a world larger than the one offered. Many people still think that a boy's trouble begins in one single act, but often it begins with what others cannot see, a look in the eyes, an inability to sit still, a question that refuses to be answered. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. The early 1910s in Indianapolis were years of expansion, but also of unease. Industry was pulling more families into the city, while farms outside the county still clung to the old ways. Automobiles were beginning to rattle down the avenues, but horse-drawn carts still delivered milk to doorsteps. Electricity was spreading, though many homes relied on kerosene lamps. Schools in neighborhoods like Dillinger's were strict, modeled on discipline rather than encouragement. Teachers taught not only reading and arithmetic, but also obedience, respect, and punctuality, the values seen as necessary for a growing industrial economy. Yet the school system often struggled with boys like John, whose restlessness was not laziness but a different kind of energy. Punishments were simple and sharp. standing in corners, lines written endlessly on chalkboards, sometimes a switch across the knuckles. These were meant to break disobedience into compliance. For some, it worked. For others, it planted seeds of resentment. Dillinger belonged to the latter. His attendance grew spotty. His grades slipped, and though his father urged discipline, the boy found ways to drift beyond the reach of classrooms, choosing alleys over arithmetic, silence over recitation. In psychological terms, we might say that Dillinger's early struggles with authority established a pattern of oppositional identity. He was not yet committing acts that anyone would call criminal, but he was learning that he did not fit within the walls others built for him. And once a child learns that, once he feels a hunger of another path, he often begins looking for doors, even if those doors are hidden in the shadows. There's another story, told years later, that young John sometimes carried out small pranks on the streets. He would take a neighbor's coal bucket and hide it behind fences, or sneak apples from a stand and leave the coins jumbled in the wrong box, as though defiance mattered more than the act itself. These were not great crimes. They were whispers of rebellion, the kind a boy performs to remind himself that he is not entirely under control. His friends laughed, but John's face, they said, stayed serious. It wasn't joy that drove him. It was something else, an urge to test boundaries, to see how far the line would bend. Psychologically, this reflects a tension we can still recognize today. The difference between mischief and compulsion. Mischief seeks laughter. Compulsion seeks release. For Dillinger, each small defiance was not about entertaining his peers, but about soothing the hunger inside. He could not always name it, but he could feel it. The world felt narrow. The walls felt close. To step even an inch beyond them was a relief, as though his lungs could finally fill. His father, noticing, responded the only way he knew, with stricter rules, harsher consequences, sharper lectures about the value of work and the dangers of waste. But the more John was pressed, the more he strained against the pressure. It is one of the oldest paradoxes in human psychology. Authority that tightens too strongly can fracture rather than fortify. So, what do you think? Is a boy made stronger by rules, or does he sometimes find his strength only by breaking them? The streets themselves offered lessons that the classroom could not. Indianapolis, by 1912, was filled with contrasts. New department stores with shining windows stood near shabby tenements. Bank buildings rose in clean limestone, while children scavenged in alleys just blocks away. The sight of wealth, so close yet so untouchable, imprinted itself on boys like Dillinger. They learned early that money commanded respect, that appearance shaped destiny. For those raised in modest homes, this knowledge could cut deeply. It whispered of opportunities withheld, of doors closed unless one learned how to open them without keys. At night, the boy would sometimes sit near his window, the lamplight dimming as the household settled into silence. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of a train passing through. The whistle stretched across the fields, carrying with it the suggestion of places beyond Indiana. Many young men of his generation dreamed of such escape, of moving west, of finding opportunity in cities like Chicago or Detroit. Dillinger listened, and in that sound, perhaps, found a promise that rules could not hold forever. From a psychological perspective, we see in these early years the shaping of what scholars later called Dillinger's restless orientation. He was not content with repetition, not soothed by structure. Instead, he sought variation, novelty, the rush of something unexpected. This trait, common among risk-takers, can serve noble purposes in some, explorers, inventors, artists. But when paired with poor schooling, harsh discipline, and limited opportunity, it can easily bend toward rebellion. Dillinger's quiet hunger was not for mischief itself, but for freedom, the sense that he could live on his own terms, beyond the rules others imposed. So, what do you think? If a child grows up longing for freedom, but every path to freedom is blocked, does he eventually learn to carve his own doors, no matter the cost? Let the light grow softer. Imagine John walking home one evening, the winter dusk settling over the streets, the last bit of sun slipping behind church steeples. His breath fogs in front of him, his small hands shoved deep into his pockets. He does not rush. He does not chatter. His footsteps echo faintly against the frozen ground, measured, thoughtful, older than his years. In his eyes there lingers that quiet hunger, an unspoken desire for more than the world seems ready to give. The city grows quiet around him. Lamps flicker on. Families gather at tables. And John, still a boy, fades into the night's rhythm. The hunger in his eyes does not fade. It waits, patient, silent, shaping the man he will become. And as the winter deepens, as the city exhales into slumber, we too may find ourselves drifting, carried by those same footsteps into sleep. The air in Indianapolis carried a different weight in the summer of 1915. The snow had long melted, leaving streets coated in dust and the smell of coal smoke that seemed to cling even in warmer months. Children ran barefoot through alleys, their laughter mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional rattle of an automobile on the uneven bricks. For young John Dillinger, now approaching adolescence, the city was both playground and prison. He knew its corners, its shortcuts, its abandoned lots where weeds grew tall against rusted fences. Those fences stood like silent guardians, boundaries that dared boys to climb. And John, restless as ever, could rarely resist. There's a story that one afternoon he found himself standing at the edge of a field, its perimeter marked by a long iron fence, flaking with rust. On the other side sat an orchard, the branches heavy with apples, red and ripe in the sunlight. Other boys dared one another to scale the fence, to slip through and take what wasn't theirs. Most hesitated, but John's eyes, always carrying that quiet hunger, narrowed with decision. He climbed, his hands scraping against the metal, his shoes slipping briefly before he dropped to the other side. When he emerged, his pockets full, the other boys cheered softly. Yet John said nothing. He simply chewed, eyes fixed on something farther than the orchard. It wasn't the apple he wanted. It was the moment, the act of crossing a line and finding that the world did not collapse in punishment. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1915, Indianapolis was undergoing visible change. The city's population had swelled past 200,000, fueled by industry and migration. Immigrant families, many from Germany and Eastern Europe, filled neighborhoods with new languages and traditions. The Great War had begun overseas, though America had not yet entered. Still, its echoes shaped life in subtle ways. Newspapers carried stories of distant battlefields, and factories hummed with increased production. For boys like Dillinger, these changes were felt less in politics and more in the shifting texture of daily life. The city was no longer as small or as predictable as it once seemed. Law enforcement remained localized, still lacking the centralized strength it would later wield. Police officers patrolled on foot, often knowing families personally. But their reach was limited, their methods more reactive than preventive. A boy who climbed fences, who tested limits in alleys and back lots, might go unnoticed unless his defiance became too bold. This gap in oversight created an invisible space where mischief could grow unchecked. And in that space, Dillinger began to test himself. Many people still think that criminality is born from desire for gain, but sometimes it is born simply from the desire to feel. Dillinger was not poor in the sense of hunger. His family had food, shelter, a father's discipline. What he lacked was release, the freedom to explore without the constant shadow of correction. The orchard was just an orchard. The apple was just an apple. Yet when he bit into it, tasting the sharp sweetness against the summer heat, it carried the flavor of defiance. A rusted fence had been crossed. A small promise of obedience had been broken, and something inside him stirred with satisfaction. Psychologists often describe this as threshold behavior. Once an individual learns that lines can be crossed without devastating consequence, the brain records it. The fear that once kept them still weakens, replaced by curiosity, then confidence. For Dillinger, that afternoon was less about fruit than about testing boundaries. He returned home with scraped hands, dust on his clothes, and a new memory that whispered to him, rules bend if you push them. At school, the same hunger showed itself more clearly. John's teachers noticed his unwillingness to submit to authority. He cut classes, choosing instead to wander streets or linger near rail yards where locomotives hissed like living creatures. He learned to play small tricks, gambling pennies with classmates, skipping lessons to sneak into theaters where silent films flickered their shadows against white screens. The figures on those screens, heroes, villains, drifters, gave him images of freedom, men who lived by their own codes, unbound by chalkboards and sermons. His young mind absorbed those images as though they were secret maps. At home, his father tried harder to impose order. The grocer's ledgers balanced neatly, but his son did not. Lectures grew sharper, punishments more severe, yet the distance between them only widened. Dillinger, sensitive beneath his restlessness, began to feel both guilt and defiance, the strange mix that often shapes future choices. He wanted his father's respect, but could not live inside his father's rules. Every reprimand reminded him of what he could not be. Every punishment carved deeper the certainty that he was different. So, what do you think? When a boy feels both guilt and defiance, does he bend back toward obedience, or does he begin to wear defiance like armor? There's another story told by neighbors, that around this time John began to form bonds with other boys who shared his appetite for mischief. They met in alleys behind barns near the edges of rail yards. Together, they played games that blurred the line between harmless fun and dangerous risk, hopping onto slow-moving trains, sneaking into forbidden spaces, daring one another to acts that tested courage. For Dillinger, these friendships mattered deeply. They gave him something the classroom did not, belonging without restraint. Within the group, his restlessness was not a flaw, but a strength. He became a quiet leader, not through force, but through his willingness to act first, to cross the line others only dared to imagine. In psychological terms, this was the beginning of reinforcement. Every time John defied a rule and found admiration in the eyes of his peers, the behavior gained value. Approval fed rebellion, and rebellion fed approval. A cycle had begun, subtle but strong, shaping his sense of identity. As we reflect, we must remember the larger world shaping this boy. The Great War loomed closer. Factories expanded. The nation prepared for transformations it could not yet imagine. But for John Dillinger, the world was still immediate. The rusted fences, the orchards, the alleys, the laughter of boys daring one another under summer skies. These small spaces were his battlegrounds. And each broken promise, each small theft of freedom, stitched together the outline of the man he would become. Many people still think that destiny is written in great moments, but often it is written in whispers, in the choice to climb a fence, in the taste of an apple, in the silence of a boy who learns to cross lines without speaking of it. As this chapter closes, let us soften the atmosphere once more. Imagine young John walking home at dusk, the air cooling after a long summer day. His pockets are empty now, the apples eaten, the orchard behind him. His hands are sore from the rusted fence, his shirt damp with sweat, yet his eyes are steady, carrying that quiet hunger still. The lamplighters are making their rounds, striking sparks against iron poles. One by one, the city glows with muted warmth. Families settle into their homes, the sounds of supper drifting through open windows. John walks a little slower, savoring the quiet. The broken promises of the day weigh lightly on his shoulders. Tomorrow will bring new fences, new chances to test, new whispers of freedom. And as the evening deepens into night, the boy's footsteps fade into silence, leaving only the stillness of Summer City, preparing to sleep. Perhaps you can hear it too, the rustle of leaves, the quiet sigh of wind through iron bars, and the steady rhythm of a restless boy learning how fragile rules can be. The autumn of 1917 fell over Indianapolis with the weight of muted skies. The leaves, copper and gold, clung briefly to the trees before scattering across alleys and doorsteps. Lanterns burned low in shop windows, their glow spilling against sidewalks slick with rain. For John Dillinger, now a teenager, these streets had become something more than background. They had become invitation. Shadows seemed to lean toward him, offering secrets. Doorways whispered of hidden paths. It was during these years that the boy who once lingered at fences began slipping through secret doors, guided by older hands that knew the city's darker rhythms. There's a story that John first fell in with older youths not through chance, but through magnetism. His restlessness, his willingness to act where others hesitated, marked him as someone to watch. Men a few years older, already practiced in cutting corners, noticed. They saw in him a boy willing to follow, eager to learn. They invited him into their company. Not loudly, not with promises, but with casual acceptance. A seat at a backroom table, a cigarette passed, a whispered dare. John accepted each without question. Many people still think that corruption arrives suddenly, in one dramatic moment. But more often it arrives slowly, as a lantern glow in a darkened room, promising warmth to a boy already cold with restlessness. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1917, the United States had entered the Great War. Indianapolis factories thrummed with military contracts, producing uniforms, weapons, and supplies. The city pulsed with labor, and young men were being called to service overseas. Patriotism mixed uneasily with weariness. For working-class neighborhoods, opportunity meant long hours and little rest. Young boys without steady direction often found themselves drifting at the edges of industry, looking for meaning elsewhere. Policing in this era remained localized. The Indianapolis police force, stretched thin by wartime demands, often focused more on labor disputes and public order than on small-time delinquency. Neighborhood troublemakers, unless caught in clear violation, rarely faced lasting consequences. It was in this gap that boys like Dillinger slipped. Older men, already dabbling in petty rackets, small gambling rings, stolen goods, the moving of contraband liquor even before Prohibition officially began, operated with relative freedom. To a restless teenager, their world seemed not only exciting but possible. One night, John followed them into a dimly lit back room behind a tavern. The air was heavy with smoke, the table scarred by years of use, lanterns hanging low from rusted hooks, cards slapped against wood, coins clinked into piles. The older men spoke in low voices, their laughter carrying the weight of experience. John said little. He watched. He absorbed. The shuffle of cards, the rhythm of wagers, the casual way rules were bent. It all imprinted itself on him. He wasn't simply learning games of chance. He was learning how men carried themselves when living outside official boundaries. Psychologists might call this stage social modeling. A young man, searching for identity, mirrors the behavior of those he admires. John's father had offered him rules and punishment. These older boys offered him inclusion, respect, and the thrill of secrecy. In that lantern-lit room, he found something he had been missing, a place where his restlessness was not criticized but valued. His quiet hunger became a tool. His willingness to act, his ability to watch closely, earned him small nods of approval. There's a story that one of these nights, John was asked to deliver a package. It was nothing dramatic, just a small box carried across town, handed discreetly to a man waiting near the rail yard. John never asked what it contained. He didn't need to. The point was not the package. The point was trust. When he returned, the men greeted him with silent smiles. In that moment, he felt something powerful. Belonging. So, what do you think? When a boy finds belonging in secrecy, does he truly choose a path? Or is the path already choosing him? The lantern-lit rooms taught him more than games. They taught him posture, the way men leaned back in chairs, as if nothing could shake them. They taught him language, soft tones, deliberate pauses, words chosen carefully so nothing incriminating slipped. They taught him rhythm, the way nights unfolded when rules bent quietly in the dark. For Dillinger, each lesson etched itself deeper than any schoolbook. His father, meanwhile, saw the change but could not stop it. The lectures continued, sharper than ever. The punishments, too. But the boy who once felt guilt now began to feel only distance. Authority at home no longer mattered as much as acceptance in the streets. And each broken promise, each secret carried under cover of night, widened the space between them. Let's pause with a historical reflection. The seeds of Prohibition were already stirring in Indiana. By 1918, statewide bans on alcohol were being debated and enforced in patches, years before the national law took hold in 1920. Speakeasies, hidden taverns, and underground networks began to sprout. For restless young men, this environment provided both temptation and opportunity. Dillinger was not yet a man of liquor or guns, but he was learning how shadows worked, how doors opened when the law turned its head, how money changed hands quietly, how trust was built in silence. Psychologically, this period marks a critical turning point. Dillinger was still a teenager, impressionable and searching. But each night spent in lantern light, each secret door entered, reinforced a new identity. He was no longer only the restless boy at the fence. He was becoming someone who knew how to move unseen, how to belong to circles that promised power through silence. The hunger in his eyes was finding nourishment. Many people still think that crime begins with greed, but often it begins with longing, the longing to be noticed, to belong, to step through a door where approval waits on the other side. As this chapter drifts toward closing, let us soften the imagery once more. Picture John walking home from one of those lantern-lit nights. The streets are damp with rain, the glow of gas lamps shimmering in puddles. His footsteps echo lightly against cobblestone, steady and unhurried. In his pocket sits a small coin given for the errand, its weight more symbolic than valuable. He passes houses where families sleep, the windows dark, curtains drawn. His own home waits ahead, stern and silent. But John is not thinking of discipline or punishment. He is thinking of the lantern glow, the smoke-filled room, the secret door that opened for him tonight. Behind him, the city exhales into silence. Above him, the clouds part briefly to reveal a pale slice of moon. And within him, something settles, the quiet certainty that has begun to walk a path different from the one laid out by his father's hand. The night softens. The boy slows his steps. And in the stillness, Indianapolis drifts into slumber, carried with the faint glow of lanterns and the promise of doors that only shadows can open. By the winter of 1918, the war had stretched in the neighborhoods of Indianapolis. Older boys left in uniform. Trains carried them eastward, and mothers pressed faces to windows until steam and distance erased the sight. Yet not every young man was called away. Some slipped between the cracks, lingering in alleyways and back rooms, their lives unfolding far from the trenches of France. John Dillinger, still only a restless teenager, remained among them. The lantern-lit gatherings of his earlier nights had become something steady now, almost ritual, and through them, he began to hear a new language, one not spoken in schoolrooms or sermons. It was a language of locked rooms, a quiet vocabulary whispered by those who lived beyond the reach of open streets. There's a story that the first time John saw a lock picked, he felt a curious stillness settle inside him. An older youth, perhaps 3, maybe 4 years a senior, held a simple door lock in hand, a bent piece of wire poised like a delicate instrument. The process was almost silent. A small twist, a gentle pressure, and then the click. The door yielded without protest. No broken glass. No forced entry. Just silence giving way to access. For Dillinger, that sound, the soft release of a lock, spoke more powerfully than 100 lectures. It was not violence that impressed him. It was precision, skill, control, and above all, the promise that the world, built on barriers, could be undone quietly. Let's anchor this in history. At the time, burglary and theft in Indiana were not uncommon. Industrial cities, with their endless warehouses and storerooms, offered both temptation and opportunity. Tools of the trade were crude by modern standards. Simple lockpicks, skeleton keys, crowbars, but in skilled hands, they became instruments of possibility. Police reports of the era mention youthful delinquents caught with stolen tools, their arrests often brief interruptions rather than permanent stops. In these years, Dillinger was not yet a name. He was only one of many young men drifting toward the margins. But unlike some, he carried within him a quiet patience, a willingness to study. The language of locked rooms was not just about doors. It was about learning to see what others overlooked, the weakness in a latch, the rhythm of a night watchman's steps, the way silence could stretch long enough to cover one's movements. Psychologists might describe this as early conditioning. A boy learns that rules can bend if you understand their seams. He discovers that doors, meant to keep him out, can be persuaded otherwise. In a home where authority was rigid and often harsh, the ability to slip through barriers became more than rebellion. It became liberation. There's another story told in hushed recollection. One evening, John accompanied a small group to a warehouse on the edge of town. The men had no plan for riches, only for practice. They showed him how to move softly across gravel, how to pause when lantern light flickered across windows, how to press against the wood until the night itself seemed to cover their presence. Inside, the warehouse was empty but for crates stacked in neat rows. They touched nothing. They simply showed him how silence felt when carried into forbidden spaces. John never forgot it. For the first time, he understood that crime was not always about the taking. Sometimes it was about the entering, about the door that said no, and the lock that whispered perhaps. And yet, beneath the thrill, there was something more subtle, a sense of belonging. These older figures spoke in tones he had come to know. Half-jokes, quiet warnings, unspoken respect for silence. They did not need to explain everything. The room itself, the locked door opened, was explanation enough. For Dillinger, it was like learning a new dialect. He did not yet have a fluency, but each night, each whispered instruction, made him more fluent in a world his father would never understand. Let's pause here with another historical frame. By 1918 to 1919, the United States stood at the threshold of Prohibition. The Volstead Act was only months away. Already, in cities like Indianapolis, hidden taverns and secret storerooms began to prepare. Locked doors no longer meant safety. They meant opportunity. Places where liquor could be stored, where games could be played, where men could meet unseen. For a boy learning to listen to the whispers of locks, this shifting world provided endless lessons. And so the locked rooms became more than practice. They became metaphor. Each door represented an authority waiting to be challenged. Each open lock told him that nothing was absolute, that behind barriers lay spaces meant only for those bold enough to cross. Psychologically, this stage reveals a transformation of restlessness into skill. Dillinger was no longer simply hungry for belonging. He was beginning to train his instincts, sharpening them with repetition. He learned to time his steps with the rhythm of silence. He learned to still his breath until the world itself seemed to pause with him. He learned that risk could be calculated, and that fear, when contained, became power. One could argue that in these moments, Dillinger's path was set, not because he committed great crimes, but because he found meaning in the smallest ones. Meaning in silence. Meaning in the turning of a lock. Meaning in the language no schoolteacher could have given him. There's a small, almost forgotten anecdote that on one occasion, John was left alone to guard the entrance while the others slipped inside. He stood by the alley, heart pounding, ears straining for any sign of footsteps. The minutes stretched endlessly, and then quietly he realized something. He wasn't afraid, not in the way he once had been. He was alert, yes, but steady. When the men returned, they found him leaning casually against the wall, as though he belonged there. That composure, that stillness, those who knew him later would recognize it as a defining mark. Even in chaos, John Dillinger carried a curious calm. Let us soften the close as the night once again folds over the city. Imagine him walking home after one of these small lessons. The streets are narrow, the air cold with approaching winter. In his pocket, he carries nothing stolen, nothing tangible. Yet inside, he carries something weightier, the knowledge that he now speaks a language hidden from most of the world. The gas lamps flicker. Houses line the street, their windows warm with family light. He passes them quietly, knowing his own home waits ahead with its stern walls and heavier silences. But the boy who enters is not the same as the one who left. He carries with him the sound of a lock surrendering, the rhythm of footsteps measured in patience, the taste of freedom found in forbidden rooms. And so the night settles, and John Dillinger, still only a restless youth, begins to master a skill that would one day define him. The language of locked rooms, silent, precise, and endlessly dangerous. By the early 1920s, Indianapolis was changing. The war had ended. Soldiers returned with stories of foreign fields, and America was slipping into an era of contradictions. Rigid morality on the surface, but behind it, hidden corners filled with liquor, dice, and music that refused to stay quiet. Prohibition had turned ordinary bottles into contraband, and with it, a new map of the city emerged, one that thrived in shadows. For John Dillinger, these years carried a scent of smoke and the sound of quiet clapping. Pool halls, taverns disguised as social clubs, and dimly lit backrooms became his new classrooms. The lantern-lit lessons of locks and silence gave way to another education. Charm, deception, and the art being noticed only when he wanted to be. There's a story told of a night when Dillinger, still just a young man, barely out of boyhood, watched a crowd gather around a pool table. A man, older, broad-shouldered, claimed the table with heavy hands and louder words. Money slipped onto the felt, bets exchanged in low voices. The room thickened with cigarette smoke, and eyes followed the break of the cue. Dillinger leaned against the wall, silent, studying. He had learned by then that attention was a currency more valuable than coins. To spend it recklessly was to lose it, but to hold it and release it at just the right moment, that was power. When his turn came, the room quieted almost without knowing why. He chalked the cue with a casual hand, lined his shot with the stillness of someone far older, and sank the ball with precision, not one but two in succession. For a brief moment, silence stretched. Then applause broke, not thunderous, not overwhelming, but sharp, sudden, enough to cut through the smoke. Dillinger smiled, not wide, but enough. The lesson was clear. Skill, when paired with timing, drew people closer. Respect was not demanded. It was cultivated. Historically, pool halls and taverns were more than places of leisure. In Prohibition-era Indiana, they doubled as meeting grounds for men on the edge of the law. Gambling, illegal liquor, small-time racketeering. They were incubators of both crime and camaraderie. For a restless young man like Dillinger, they provided something his rigid home never did, recognition. In these smoky rooms, his silence became intrigue, his sharp eyes a kind of presence. He wasn't the loudest voice. He wasn't the strongest fist. But he carried himself with composure that unsettled some and fascinated others. Psychologists might call this stage social reinforcement. A young man who once felt invisible learns that his actions, small, deliberate, calculated, can pull attention without force. Applause, even from strangers, carries weight. For Dillinger, this meant something profound. He was no longer only a student of locked doors. He was now a student of people. And in those back rooms, the lessons were endless. He learned the rhythm of dice games, how laughter could mask suspicion, how a favor offered at the right moment could open doors more effectively than any skeleton key. He discovered that charm, when used sparingly, could be as sharp as a blade. There's another story, remembered faintly, of a night when a card game grew tense. Accusations hung in the air, fists tightened around the edges of the table. Dillinger, not yet 20, leaned in with a smile, calm, almost disarming, and cracked a joke so small, so dry, that the tension broke. Laughter replaced anger. The fists loosened. The game resumed. It wasn't the joke itself that mattered. It was the timing, the way he read the room, the way he waited for silence to lean just far enough into danger before pulling it back. That moment revealed something his companions never forgot. Dillinger understood people. He knew when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to strike, not with violence, but with words. Let us anchor again in history. By the early 1920s, Indiana was wrestling with economic shifts. Industry pulled men into factories, while rural families struggled with the grind of farmland. Cities grew restless, and with Prohibition, the underground economy thrived. Taverns masqueraded as soft drink parlors, where a whisper request could produce a bottle hidden under the counter. Smoke-filled halls echoed with laughter, but beneath it ran currents of secrecy, tension, and opportunity. Dillinger found himself in this environment, neither fully inside nor outside the law. He was not yet the notorious outlaw who would one day dominate headlines. He was a young man, unremarkable to most, but quietly gathering tools, charm, timing, presence, that would one day sharpen into weapons. Psychologically, this period represents a crucial shift. Dillinger was learning that crime did not exist in isolation. It thrived in communities, in networks of trust and deception. To survive in such circles, one needed more than skill with locks. One needed the ability to move through a room without raising suspicion, to be liked without being exposed, to be remembered without being traced. And Dillinger excelled. Where others stumbled over their words, he carried silence like a shield. Where others demanded attention, he let it come to him. He discovered that applause, when it came, was sweeter because it was not chased. There's a small, almost cinematic image that lingers from this time. A pool hall, the hour late, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Dillinger steps back from the table, cue resting lightly in his hand. The crowd, a mix of laborers, gamblers, and small-time hustlers, claps. Not for money on the felt, not for the shot itself, but for the composure with which it was made. And in that applause, Dillinger hears something deeper. Not just approval, but acknowledgement. He is no longer the boy overlooked by his father's stern hand, no longer the restless figure slipping unnoticed through alleys. In that moment, beneath the glow of dim lights and the haze of cigarette smoke, he is seen. As the night thins and footsteps scatter across empty streets, Dillinger walks home with that sound still echoing in his head. The applause lingers longer than the laughter, longer than the smoke. It whispers to him in the silence of his room, telling him that he holds something powerful. Not brute force, not wealth, but presence, the ability to bend a room without breaking it, to turn silence into recognition, to make people lean closer, waiting, listening. And so another chapter of his education closes. From locks and silence to charm and applause, John Dillinger is no longer only a boy learning how to enter rooms. He is becoming a man who can command them. Every outlaw story, no matter how solitary it begins, eventually turns toward companionship, not friendship in the ordinary sense, not the soft comfort of shared meals or the loyalty of unbroken bonds, but alliances forged in dim corners where silence is currency and trust is weighed against survival. For John Dillinger, those corners appeared in Indianapolis backrooms, alleys behind taverns, and the hushed corners of pool halls. The applause that once felt like recognition soon became an introduction. People noticed. Some were curious. Others were cautious. A few saw in him what he did not yet fully see in himself. The beginnings of a leader. One remembered night. The room was louder than usual. A card game ran deep into midnight, and coins clattered against the table like restless nerves. A man named Edgar Singleton sat across from Dillinger, a wiry figure with quick hands, known for petty scams and sharper words. Their first exchange wasn't warm. Singleton accused Dillinger of playing too carefully, holding back cards as though he was hiding more than luck. But Dillinger only smiled, laid his hand down with a calm that unsettled the table, and collected the winnings. The tension broke into laughter, and for reasons difficult to explain, Singleton leaned back and studied him. Not long after, the two were seen walking side by side down quiet streets, the beginning of an alliance. Historically, Singleton was one of Dillinger's earliest criminal companions. Their paths crossed in Indianapolis, both drawn into a low-level world of theft and petty schemes. Singleton was impulsive, prone to fast decisions and reckless risks. Dillinger, even in youth, carried the opposite trait, measured patience, silence before action. It was an unlikely balance, but one that made sense. Where Singleton pushed too quickly, Dillinger steadied the pace. Where Dillinger's restraint threatened to stall, Singleton's recklessness pulled them forward. Together, they represented the two halves of a coin that, when flipped, often landed in their favor. Psychologically, this was a turning point. A young man who once moved through alleys alone now discovered the dangerous allure of companionship. There's power in being noticed, but there's greater power in being joined, to walk with another. Even one as unstable as Singleton was to feel less like an outsider and more like part of something larger. Humans are not built for isolation. Even those who prefer silence, like Dillinger, seek mirrors, someone to confirm that their path, however crooked, is real. In Singleton, Dillinger found that mirror, and in the reflection, he began to see not just himself, but the shape of a future that stretched beyond solitary tricks. The historical backdrop deepens this picture. In the early 1920s, Indianapolis was thick with small-time gangs. They weren't the sprawling syndicates of Chicago or New York, but localized groups, bands of young men who drifted together for petty theft, gambling, and illegal liquor distribution. The Great Depression had not yet arrived, but hardship still marked the lives of working-class youth. For many, crime was not ideology, it was practicality. In these groups, alliances were fragile, loyalty conditional, and betrayal a constant risk. Yet within them, Dillinger began to learn the architecture of organized crime, however small-scale it appeared. Leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about carrying a presence that others leaned toward, whether out of respect, fear, or curiosity. There's a small scene remembered among those who later spoke of Dillinger, a tavern dimly lit, with the smell of spilled beer and smoke hanging heavy. Singleton, restless as always, mouthed off to a man twice his size. A fight seemed inevitable, fists already tightening, voices already rising. But before the first punch landed, Dillinger stepped forward, not loudly, not aggressively. He placed a hand on Singleton's shoulder, looked the larger man in the eye, and spoke so quietly that only those closest could hear. The words are lost to time, but the effect was not. The tension dissolved. The man stepped back. The fight never came. It wasn't force that carried the moment. It was a strange weight of Dillinger's calm, the ability to enter a storm and still the winds without raising his own voice. Psychologists might call this emergent leadership, not the kind born from appointed authority, but the kind that rises naturally when others recognize steadiness amidst chaos. Dillinger, still just a youth, displayed the beginnings of this quality. He did not demand attention. He absorbed it. He did not chase authority. It found him, quietly, in smoke-filled rooms where others faltered. And so, the circle around him grew. Singleton was the first, but not the last. Men who gambled, men who drank, men who drifted on the edges of lawlessness. One by one, they began to notice Dillinger's presence, not as a man of power, not yet, but as someone different, someone worth standing beside. History reminds us that alliances in crime are not the same as friendships. They are bargains, silent contracts written in risk and necessity. Dillinger understood this. He did not seek affection. He sought alignment, people whose flaws could balance his own, whose presence could shield him from standing alone too often. This lesson, though quiet, was permanent. It taught him that crime was not a solitary pursuit. It was communal, reliant on networks, circles, and companions found in the shadows. Later, when Dillinger would lead entire gangs into banks and across state lines, this foundation, the psychology of alliances, would prove essential. There is an image worth holding on to. Two young men, barely more than boys, walking down an empty Indianapolis street at night, their coats pulled tight against the cold, their laughter muffled by the hour. One talks too much, words spilling into the air like restless dice. The other listens, silent, eyes scanning alleys and doorways. Together, they look ordinary, forgettable. And yet, in the quiet space between them, something is forming. Not friendship, not yet, but a bond stitched by shadows. As dawn breaks and the city stirs awake, Dillinger returns to his small room. Singleton's voice still echoes in his ear, quick and brash. Yet it is not the words he carries with him. It is the realization that he is no longer alone in this path. He lies awake, staring at the ceiling, and feels the weight of something new. Not applause this time, not recognition, but alliance. The quiet certainty that shadows, when walked together, grow less heavy. And so, John Dillinger takes another step forward. Not as a silent boy who once studied locked doors, but as a young man beginning to gather a circle. Allies, not yet loyal, not yet tested, but present, found in shadowed corners, where the first outlines of gang are drawn, faint and fragile, waiting for history to darken the ink. Fortune rarely arrives as a sudden gift. More often, it is chased down dark streets, stumbled upon in alleys, or mistaken for luck until it reveals itself as consequence. For John Dillinger, the road toward fortune did not begin with riches or glory. It began with experiments, small ventures, half-planned, the kind of schemes that tested both courage and carelessness. The allies he gathered in shadowed corners became companions on this road. Singleton was loud, restless, always urging for the bigger step. Dillinger was cautious, almost reluctant, measuring the weight of every risk. Between them, tension built, but tension has a way of shaping direction. The first step was simple. A pocket picked clean in the dark of a theater. The prize little more than coins and a cheap watch. Singleton laughed, bragged, and waved the trinket as though it were a crown. Dillinger said little. only examined the watch, then returned it to the pocket of his own coat as if filing it away. It was not about the prize. It was about the practice. To learn how swiftly an act could be done, how quiet hands could move, how fast footsteps needed to be. They were not yet professionals. They were apprentices of risk, students of desperation. Historically, Dillinger's early criminal path involved small thefts and petty crimes, nothing yet resembling the legendary robberies of his later years. These were clumsy beginnings, stealing change from parked cars, swiping goods from delivery wagons, lifting wallets when the crowd was thick enough to hide a hand. Indianapolis in the early 1920s was fertile ground for such ventures. The city bustled with workers, markets, theaters, and taverns. The Prohibition era had begun, and with it, a shadow economy of bootleggers, smugglers, and small-time crooks. In this atmosphere, even minor theft felt like a rehearsal for something larger. There is a remembered incident, whispered in later retellings. Singleton convinced Dillinger to join him in stealing a car. The machine was nothing glamorous, a used, dented Ford, but to young men restless for more than coins, it was a symbol. The night was cold, their breath curling in the air as Singleton worked the lock with unsteady hands. Dillinger stood guard, scanning the street. When the engine finally sputtered alive, Singleton whooped in triumph, gripping the wheel as though he had conquered the world. But Dillinger, sitting beside him, was quiet. His eyes weren't on the road ahead, but on the rear-view mirror, watching the silent city they left behind. Even then, he understood what Singleton did not. Every road taken bent in two directions, toward fortune, yes, but also toward consequence. Psychologically, this moment reflects the duality within Dillinger. A man drawn to risk, yet haunted by its weight. The car theft wasn't about joyrides or noise. For Dillinger, it was about feeling the machinery of fate move beneath him, the hum of the engine like the heartbeat of a new identity. He was not a petty thief by nature. He was a student of escalation. Each act, no matter how small, was a rehearsal for something greater. The turning point came with a plan less clumsy than the rest. Singleton, eager for quick money, proposed robbing a local grocer. The idea was reckless, dangerous, and foolish. But to Dillinger, it carried the appeal of structure. A plan could be measured. A store could be studied. Risks could be weighed. For nights, he walked past the shop, observing. He noted the closing hours, the position of the lamps, the rhythm of customers. Singleton teased him for being overcautious, but Dillinger said nothing. He simply watched, memorized, calculated. When the night came, the attempt was crude, a mask that barely concealed, a demand muttered with more nerves than threat. The grocer hesitated, but coins were surrendered. It was not a fortune, barely enough to matter, but it was an initiation, the taste of something larger. History marks this as the early shape of Dillinger's path, small thefts escalating toward armed robbery. It was not yet mastery, not yet legend, but it was momentum. And momentum, once begun, is difficult to stop. In Indianapolis, whispers began. The quiet young man who once stood in corners was now stepping into the open, if only briefly. His reputation grew not because of the size of his crimes, but because of the steadiness with which he carried them out. Psychologically, this is the stage where identity hardens. What begins as experiment becomes habit. What feels like choice becomes character. Dillinger's silence, his careful observations, his willingness to let others speak while he watched, all of it formed the groundwork of a leader. He was not reckless like Singleton. He was not content with petty rewards. He saw in every theft not the prize itself, but the lesson behind it. How fear worked in the victim's eyes, how quickly law responded, how escape routes mattered more than entrances. To Dillinger, crime was becoming less about need and more about study. There's a small image worth remembering. A late night, coins scattered on a table, Singleton laughing too loudly, boasting of their winnings. Dillinger sits in the corner, not touching the coins, not smiling. He stares instead at the empty street outside the window, the lamplight bending across the pavement. In that gaze lies the difference between the two men. Singleton saw the moment. Dillinger saw the road. And that road, though bent and uncertain, stretched farther than either of them yet realized. Fortune, when it arrived, was not measured in wealth. It was measured in direction. With each theft, each scheme, Dillinger's path bent further away from the boy who studied locks in silence, and closer to the man who would one day lead gangs across states. But for now, he remained in the in-between, a youth with one hand still in petty theft, and the other reaching toward larger ambitions. A man walking roads that bent, not always wisely, but always forward. The night closes on Indianapolis. Horses clatter down cobblestones, lanterns dim one by one, and the streets fall silent. In a small room above a tavern, Dillinger lies awake again. Singleton snores on the floor, drunk on cheap whiskey, the stolen coin scattered carelessly beside him. Dillinger does not sleep. He listens instead to the rhythm of the city, breathing outside his window. His mind traces the bends of roads not yet taken, the outline of fortunes not yet claimed. And in that silence, beneath the weight of early mistakes and small victories, he feels it, the momentum of something larger, pulling him onward. The road ahead is uncertain, but it bends always toward fortune. Every figure who rises in the underworld begins alone, but no one stays that way. The streets are not kind to solitude. The law hunts the loner quickly, and fortune, such as it is, demands witnesses. John Dillinger, though quiet by nature, understood this truth early. His circle did not appear in a single moment. It formed slowly, like smoke gathering in a closed room. One man drawn by necessity, another by loyalty, another by hunger. And around Dillinger's silence, they began to gather, sensing something that Singleton's noise could never provide. In Indianapolis during the early 1920s, the criminal underworld was shifting. Bootlegging was thriving, gambling dens multiplied, and those who would keep their nerve found opportunity in every alley. Singleton introduced Dillinger to acquaintances, men with half schemes and ragged reputations. Some came and went, unable to match Dillinger's patience. But few stayed. There was Carter, a wiry figure with quick hands and quicker eyes. He had a reputation for slipping pass locks, a talent that fascinated Dillinger. Unlike Singleton, Carter rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. There was Fulton, broad-shouldered, steady, not clever but reliable, a man who had worked in warehouses before drifting into theft. Fulton brought muscle, but also an odd calm. His silence paired well with Dillinger's. And there were others, names that history only briefly remembers, if at all, men who hovered on the edges, who tested themselves in small ventures and then disappeared into obscurity. The circle was not a gang yet. It was an atmosphere, a gathering place where silence meant trust. Dillinger, though young, carried himself with a strange authority. He listened more than he spoke, and when he finally gave words, they were deliberate. Psychologically, this is where the foundation of leadership takes shape. Leadership in the underworld is not declared. It is recognized. Singleton still spoke the loudest, but when questions of risk arose, the circle's eyes turned, almost unconsciously, toward Dillinger. He never asked for command. He simply allowed silence to do the work. And in silence, his circle formed. Historically, Dillinger's early years in Indianapolis and later in Mooresville involved drifting among companions, experimenting with small crimes. He was not yet the leader of a polished crew, but the seeds were planted here. Those who met him often noted his charm, his quiet intensity, and his ability to make others believe in his plans. It is easy in hindsight to see where this path led, but in the moment, it was little more than a group of young men testing limits, drawn together by hunger, restlessness, and a world that offered few honest roads. A remembered image, a back room of a tavern, smoke drifting low, coins scattered on the table. Singleton boasts of their last theft. Carter quietly counts the money. Fulton leans against the wall, saying nothing. Dillinger sits at the edge, listening. When Singleton proposes their next reckless plan, the group glances toward Dillinger. Not openly, not yet, but enough to reveal where their trust lies. Dillinger offers a single suggestion, measured and calm, and the room shifts. The noise dims. The plan becomes his without argument. This is how circles are built, not through demand, but through gravity. Psychologically, the power of silence in a leader cannot be overstated. Where Singleton's noise demanded attention, Dillinger's quiet invited it. Men followed him not because he ordered, but because his restraint implied certainty. He studied them the way he once studied locks and streets. Carter's cleverness, Fulton's steadiness, Singleton's recklessness, all were tools. And Dillinger was learning how to use them. Their small ventures grew sharper. A delivery wagon left unwatched for too long. A warehouse door conveniently unguarded. The circle, still rough, tested itself in these spaces. Singleton would grab quickly, laughing as though fortune owed him. Carter would move with precision, knowing which goods carried value. Fulton carried the weight without complaint. And Dillinger, he guided without needing to shout. Every theft was modest, but each one carried a lesson, and lessons were what Dillinger valued most. He was not yet the notorious figure newspapers would one day call a menace. He was still a student, but now with a classroom full of allies. There is a memory, fragile but telling. After one of their modest thefts, they gathered in a cold room above a butcher's shop. The spoils were meager, some food, some cash, hardly enough to risk prison for. Singleton complained, insisting they deserved more, bigger, better. Dillinger listened, then quietly replied, "Fortune isn't taken all at once. It bends toward the patient." The word silenced the room. Fulton nodded. Carter smirked, as though recognizing the truth. Singleton muttered, but his laughter was weaker this time. The circle had spoken, though not in words. They had chosen the quiet one. Historically, it was in these years that Dillinger's trajectory became clear. Arrest was not far ahead. Mistakes would be made, betrayals suffered, prisons endured. But the structure was future. The reliance on a loyal circle, the art of planning, the leadership carried in silence, all of it was born in these shadowed gatherings. The tragedy, of course, is that loyalty, once formed in crime, carries a curse. The circle binds men together, but it also binds them to consequences they cannot escape. Late one night, after the others had gone, Dillinger remained alone in the tavern's back room. He stared at the coins left on the table, listening to the muffled sounds of the street outside. He was not thinking of wealth. He was thinking of trust, of how easily men could vanish when the law pressed close, how betrayal was as common as loyalty. He understood that a circle was fragile. To hold it required more than plans. It required something quieter, an aura, a steadiness that men could lean against. In his silence, Dillinger found the beginnings of that aura. The chapter closes with this: a circle of young men, not yet infamous, not yet refined, sitting in a smoky room, their futures uncertain. Singleton talks too loudly. Carter smiles faintly at a private joke. Fulton watches the door in case of trouble. And Dillinger, sitting quietly, holds them together without force. He does not yet know how far the road will stretch, or how violently it will end. But in this moment, the circle is formed, not by noise, not by demand, but by silence. The first time John Dillinger placed his hand on the hood of an idling automobile, he felt something close to revelation. The machine vibrated faintly beneath his fingers, as though it carried a secret pulse. Horses had carried men for centuries, but this was different. A car could outrun sound itself, or so it seemed in that moment. For Dillinger and his circle, the automobile was not just transportation. It was escape, opportunity, and symbol. Noon sun gleamed on its polished steel, and in that light, the future of crime revealed itself. By the early 1920s, cars were still a luxury in many places. Farmers clung to their wagons. Townsfolk walked familiar paths. But in cities like Indianapolis, the automobile was spreading quickly. Roads stretched wider. Gas stations appeared on corners, and the hum of engines became the background music of modern life. Criminals, too, adapted. Once, a thief might vanish into alleys or across fields. Now, with a car, he could vanish into the horizon. The police, often slower and poorly equipped, struggled to match the speed of criminals with gasoline in their tanks. Dillinger understood this advantage immediately. Where others saw novelty, he saw a weapon. The circle gathered often in rented rooms and barns, their conversations turning toward machines. Carter, with his nimble fingers, studied locks and ignitions. Fulton provided muscle, lifting crates and shifting stolen parts. Even Singleton, reckless though he was, grew fascinated by the sound of engines. It began with borrowed cars, vehicles taken for a night driven hard and abandoned before sunrise. The circle tested their limits, learning how fast they could move from one side of town to the other, how quickly they could scatter when trouble arrived. For Dillinger, each test carried lessons. He noted how long the gas lasted, how quickly a police whistle followed, how many turns a driver needed to break pursuit. It was study disguised as recklessness. Psychologically, the automobile symbolized more than speed. It represented freedom. For a young man who had once walked the frozen streets with hollow footsteps, the idea of outrunning the world held deep appeal. To move faster than the law, faster than poverty, faster than fate itself, that was power. When Dillinger sat in the passenger seat, staring at the road rushing beneath wheels, he felt not merely transported but transformed. A car turned the hunted into the untouchable. A remembered moment. The noon sun blazed on an open road outside the city. Dillinger sat behind the wheel for the first time, his hands steady, his gaze fixed forward. Singleton hooped in the back seat. Carter leaned forward with a smirk. Fulton remained silent but watchful. The engine roared, louder than any horse or wagon could ever be. Dust rose behind them as the car surged forward, the horizon collapsing into their reach. Dillinger did not smile, but inside he felt a quiet certainty. The road belonged to them now. Historically, Dillinger would become known for his use of fast cars during robberies, often outpacing police in spectacular escapes. Newspapers would later describe him as a modern outlaw, blending the romance of the Wild West with the machinery of the new century. But the seeds of that legend were planted here in these early days, when stolen automobiles became the training ground for future exploits. It was not yet about banks or nationwide manhunts. It was about learning the rhythm of speed. Carter proved especially useful. His nimble skills extended to hot wiring ignitions, a trick few understood at the time. He could slide beneath the wheel well, his fingers working quickly, and within moments an engine would spark to life. Fulton, ever steady, handled the heavier tasks, pushing stall vehicles, carrying stolen fuel. Singleton reveled in the thrill, his laughter echoing each time they roared down a road. And Dillinger, always watching, always listening, studied them all. His leadership did not come from loud orders. It came from the way his silence framed their chaos, the way his calm steadied the wheel even when the road twisted dangerously. Psychologically, the automobile also deepened Dillinger's philosophy of patience. Where Singleton saw only excitement, Dillinger saw strategy. Speed meant more than escape. It meant control. A man who could disappear faster than pursuit could never be cornered. A man who could move between towns in hours held an advantage over one trapped in a single block. The circle was learning this lesson together. Each reckless ride was, in truth, a rehearsal for something larger. There is a story, faint in memory, of a chase that ended not with capture but with revelation. The circle had taken a car from outside a theater, laughter spilling as they sped through streets. A patrolman gave chase, his horse straining against pavement. For blocks, the sound of pursuit echoed, but then with a sudden burst of speed, the automobile left the horse behind. The patrolman's shouts faded into distance. In the silence that followed, Carter laughed quietly. Singleton roared with glee. Fulton exhaled slowly. Dillinger kept his eyes on the horizon. He understood, more than the others, what that silence meant. They had left the old world behind. Historically, this shift cannot be overstated. The outlaw of the horse and revolver was becoming obsolete. The outlaw of the automobile and machine gun was emerging. Dillinger stood at the threshold of that change. The automobile, gleaming beneath noon sun, became not only a tool but a prophecy. It foretold the battles ahead, the escapes that would humiliate police, the headlines that would brand him both villain and folk hero. One night, as they sat in the dim-lighted garage, Carter working beneath the hood, Singleton boasting of their next ride, Dillinger leaned back in his chair, silent. He thought not of the next theft, but of distance, of how far a man could travel if the roads remained open. A car could carry you out of poverty, out of obscurity, even out of time. but it could not carry you out of consequence. Dillinger understood that too, and still he chose the wheel. The chapter closes with an image. A dusty road, the sun high, the horizon endless. A car glints in the light, its engine rumbling low. Inside, for men sit Singleton restless, Carter intent, Fulton calm, and Dillinger silent at the wheel. The noon sun burns above them. The road stretches endlessly ahead. The circle has found its engine, and history has found its speed. The wheel turned lightly beneath his hands. The engine growled like a restless animal. Around him, the others laughed, shouted, cursed, or clung to the seats as the car tore down a country road. But John Dillinger remained silent. Silence had always been his language. He had learned long ago that words invited judgment and noise revealed weakness. But now that silence translated into something else, control. Behind the wheel, Dillinger spoke not with his mouth, but with the steadiness of his grip, the calm of his breath, and the measured way he guided speed through danger. He was not merely a passenger anymore. He was a driver. The circle had grown accustomed to chaos. Singleton demanded it. Carter invited it. Fulton endured it. But in time, they began to notice that when Dillinger drove, the chaos lessened. Roads straightened beneath him. Corners bent without panic. Pursuits lost their sting. It was not dramatic. Dillinger never shouted commands or laughed as Singleton did. He simply moved the car as though it obeyed him, as though the road itself deferred to his patience. For a circle of young men already skirting danger, that calm became magnetic. The psychological dimension is clear. In an uncertain life, control becomes intoxicating. Dillinger, who had once walked through winters without direction, now held a machine that answered to his every touch. Where poverty had robbed him of choice, the automobile gave him mastery. The wheel became not just wood and steel, it became a compass. One remembered moment lingers in the edges of his legend. A late afternoon, somewhere on the outskirts of town. The circle had stolen a car. A pursuit had begun. A patrolman in another vehicle gave chase, his siren cutting through the air. Singleton panicked, urging Dillinger to floor the accelerator. Carter muttered instructions. Fulton's jaw tensed. Dillinger did not raise his voice. He simply spoke, steady and even, "Sit back. Let me drive." The words silenced them. His hands turned the wheel smoothly, his eyes catching every turn before it came. He slowed when others might have rushed, sped only when the road opened. At last, he pulled the car into an abandoned lane, shadowed by trees. The patrolman roared past, unaware. The circle sat in stunned quiet. Singleton let out a laugh. Carter nodded with approval. Fulton exhaled. Dillinger said nothing more. But from that day, the wheel was his. Historically, Dillinger's skill as a driver became one of his defining advantages. In the years to come, his escapes would rely as much on precision driving as on firearms. Police reports describe him weaving through traffic with uncanny control, guiding stolen cars as though they were extensions of his body. But in these early days, that reputation was only beginning. To the circle, he was no longer just a quiet man at their side. He was a calm voice behind the wheel, the one who turned chaos into direction. The group adapted around him. Singleton's wild energy found its counterbalance. Carter, usually eager to instruct, deferred to Dillinger's instinct. Fulton, who rarely trusted anyone fully, trusted the man holding the wheel. Psychologically, Dillinger's role shifted. Leadership, once shared loosely among them, began to crystallize. The man who could guide a machine through danger could also guide men through peril. He did not crown himself leader. He simply drove, and leadership followed. Another remembered image. The night sky above, stars sharp in the Indiana dark. The car moved along a dirt road, its headlights cutting pale beams into the distance. The others slept or murmured softly. Dillinger remained awake, his hands steady on the wheel. For hours, he drove without complaint. The road stretched endlessly, yet he seemed to belong to it. That image, Dillinger, silent, guiding his circle through darkness, captures the essence of his role. He was not the loudest voice, Not the most reckless, not even the most skilled with locks or fists. He was the steady center, the driver who gave motion meaning. Historically, driving offered Dillinger more than escape. It offered reflection. Hours at the wheel gave him time to think. About roads not yet traveled, about futures not yet stolen, about the thin line between chance and control. A car could outrun police, but it could not outrun time. Deep down, he must have sensed this. But for now, in these early rides, the illusion of mastery was enough. The circle began to speak differently when Dillinger drove. Singleton, instead of shouting, watched the road ahead. Carter asked questions in quieter tones. Fulton even smiled occasionally, knowing they were in steady hands. It was a small transformation, but telling. A group defined by restlessness now moved with rhythm, guided by one man's patience. Psychologically, it revealed something about Dillinger's influence. He did not change men with speeches, but with presence. His calm invited calm. His steadiness shaped theirs. There is a quiet story of a ride into the countryside. The group had stolen supplies, expecting pursuit, but none came. Still, Dillinger drove as though pursuit might arrive at any moment. Eyes watchful, hands firm, movements measured. When Singleton finally asked why he drove so carefully, Dillinger gave no answer. He simply kept his gaze on the horizon. Perhaps he understood something they did not. That the enemy was not only the police but also carelessness, impatience, overconfidence. His silence, his calm, his careful hands, all were shields against that enemy. Singleton was the first to feel it. His was a nature of fire, loud, wild, impossible to contain. He had been the spark that drew them together, the one who filled nights with noise and bravado. But sparks burned bright only for so long, and beside Dillinger's steady flame, Singleton's fire began to feel fragile. He watched Dillinger drive with unshakable calm, watched Carter nod in approval, watched Fulton lean toward him for guidance. Singleton laughed louder, boasted harder, drank deeper. But beneath it all, unease grew. It was not hatred. It was fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of his spark fading against another's quiet light. Carter, on the other hand, shifted differently. Practical, sharp-minded, he had once served as the strategist, the one who offered instructions when others hesitated. Yet Dillinger's instincts behind the wheel, his ability to move with control without seeking counsel, began to chip at Carter's authority. Where Singleton bristled with envy, Carter's tension was subtler, a quiet resentment that his voice mattered less. His words still carried weight, but less than before. A shadow lengthened across his pride. Fulton, the most reserved of the four, found himself caught between them. He had never sought to lead, never sought to shine. For him, Dillinger's calm presence was reassuring, a stability he could trust. But he saw what the others did not, that shadows had begun to form around their circle, stretching wider with each ride, each decision, each silent nod toward Dillinger. And Fulton, though quiet, understood what shadows often meant. Psychologically, this moment is revealing. Groups build on rebellion, and thrill rarely remain harmonious. The hunger for control, the desire for recognition, the fear of irrelevance, these forces gnaw at the bonds that tie men together. Dillinger, who had not asked for power, found himself in the strange position of holding it. His silence had become command, his steadiness a kind of crown. But crowns, whether sought or not, invite storms. One remembered night illustrates it. The circle sat in an abandoned barn, the air heavy with smoke and dust. A stolen lantern flickered against the wood. Singleton spoke loudly of a plan, a wild one, reckless, promising riches but heavy with risk. Carter countered, suggesting something quieter, more measured. The argument rose and fell, words crashing into one another. Fulton kept still, watching. And Dillinger? He said nothing. At last, Singleton slammed his fist against the table. "You've got nothing to say?" he demanded. Dillinger met his eyes. His voice was calm, steady, almost disarming. "I'll drive whichever road we choose, but I won't drive us into a ditch." The words hung in the air. Singleton laughed harshly, but the laugh had no fire. Carter nodded faintly, though resentment curled beneath the gesture. Fulton simply lowered his gaze. The plan was chosen, Carter's measure version, softened by Dillinger's quiet support. Singleton said little the rest of the night. The shadow lengthened. Historically, groups of young criminals fractured often. Few bonds held under the weight of fear, greed, and suspicion. Dillinger's circle was no different. These were not hardened men yet, but ambition was already a dangerous seed. In Dillinger's calm, they saw safety. But in that same calm, Singleton and Carter also saw a threat, the possibility that their roles, their voices, their sparks might fade into the background. There's another remembered image. A roadside pause, the car resting at the edge of a field. Singleton steps out, pacing with restless energy. Carter checks the supplies, muttering under his breath. Fulton leans against the car, watching the horizon. And Dillinger? He sits behind the wheel, hands resting lightly, eyes steady on the road ahead. It is a simple scene, but within it lies the essence of the tension. Dillinger, patient and quiet, grounding the circle. The others, restless in their own ways, orbiting him like shadows stretching toward dusk. Psychologically, shadows reveal more than light. Singleton's fear of irrelevance pushed him toward louder gestures. Carter's wounded pride made him sharper, quieter, more cutting in his comments. Fulton's watchful silence became heavier, as though he carried the weight of seeing what the others refused to admit. And Dillinger, who had once been a hollow boy walking winter streets, now carried the burden of leadership without asking for it. He did not seek to divide the circle, but in being himself, calm, steady, quietly commanding, he created fault lines. The circle began to fracture not in open fights, but in subtler ways. Singleton lingered at bars longer, seeking company outside the group. Carter took to planning alone, drafting schemes before presenting them. Fulton walked with longer silences, more careful steps, and Dillinger drove them through it all, his silence stretching like the roads ahead. At first, the towns barely noticed. A grocery store found itself lighter by a day's earnings. A small bank clerk stammered to the retelling of a robbery so clean, so quick, that it almost felt like a dream. A sheriff's deputy returned to his post pale-faced, unable to describe exactly what had happened, only that the men moved with a calm unlike anything he had ever seen. The pattern was faint at first. The marks they left behind were more whisper than roar, but whispers travel faster than shouts. And soon enough, entire towns began to hold their breath. There's a remembered story of Martinsville, a quiet town of modest shops and watchful eyes. One afternoon, a group of boys gathered outside the barber's shop, trading baseball cards and idle boasts. The conversation stilled when a dark car rolled slowly through the street. No windows rolled down. No threats were made. The engine was steady, unhurried, but everyone felt it. The car belonged to men who carried silence like a weapon. That night, shopkeepers counted their cash drawers twice. Doors were bolted tighter. Mothers called children in earlier than usual. Fear had moved in without a word. What made Dillinger and his circle unique in those years was not simply what they took. It was how they carried themselves in the act. Singleton might crack a grin, but it was not the grin of carelessness. It was a grin of a man who enjoyed the edge of fear in others' eyes. Carter spoke in clipped instructions, calm, precise, as though rehearsing lines in a play he had mastered. Fulton remained quiet, his presence unsettling in its restraint. And Dillinger? He was the calm center. His movements were smooth, his voice even, his eyes steady. In a robbery, he did not bark orders or scream threats. He simply acted with the quiet authority of a man who knew the room already belonged to him. That silence frightened people more than any gunshot. Psychologically, communities unravel when ordinary rhythms are disrupted. Fear turns familiar spaces into uncertain ground. The grocer wonders if the door will swing open with more than customers. The banker flinches at every shadow crossing the window. The local sheriff, once a figure of calm authority, feels the weight of being outmatched. For Dillinger's circle, this unraveling was not accidental. It was part of their power. They understood, whether consciously or not, that fear worked better than bullets. A shot might silence one man. Silence itself could unsettle an entire town. A remembered evening in Mooresville paints the picture more clearly. The town's single bank was quiet, lit by the low sun. Inside, Clerk sorted papers, the day's routine unbroken. The door swung open, and 4 men stepped in. Singleton's grin appeared first, disarming yet cold. Carter spoke next, his voice carrying calm directions. Nobody move. Stay where you are. This will be over soon. Dillinger stood at the counter, steady as stone, eyes level with the clerk. He did not shout. He did not wave his weapon. He simply looked, and the clerk froze, heart racing as though the silence itself pressed against his chest. Minutes later, the men were gone. No shots fired. No screams heard. Yet when the townspeople gathered that night, they spoke as if a storm had passed through, one that had left no wreckage but had stolen the air itself. The circle began to move from town to town, and with each stop, the same pattern unfolded. Shadows lengthened across Indiana's map, not in lines of destruction, but in pockets of silence. These were not hardened killers yet, not the legends they would later become, but already they carried with them a weight that unsettled the ordinary world. Dillinger himself, though still a young man, began to feel the transformation. He had once been the hollow boy of Indianapolis, walking cold streets with empty pockets. Now, entire towns shifted their breath when his car rolled through. He did not smile at the power. He did not boast. But in his eyes, there was something new, a recognition that silence could build empires as surely as sound. Psychologically, fear on a communal scale is both fragile and powerful. It cannot be seen, cannot be held, yet it bends behavior with remarkable strength. People close doors earlier. They watch shadows more closely. They remember faces long after they are gone. For Dillinger and his circle, this fear became their true weapon. Guns were tools. Cars were vessels. But silence, that was their signature. There is one last image, carried from memory. A small town church, its bell tolling in the evening. Families walk home from the service, voices low. A boy points toward the road, where a car idles briefly before moving on. His mother hushes him quickly, pulling him close. The car does not stop. It does not need to. The town is already afraid. So the legend began not in the roar of violence, but in the hush of fear. Dillinger's name was not yet spoken across the nation, but in Indiana's quiet towns, the silence he left behind began to speak louder than any headline. And towns, once defined by routine, now carried an unease that grew each time headlights cut across their windows. The outlaw's shadow had begun to spread. There is a sound that does not belong to the countryside. It cuts through the stillness like a blade, jagged and unrelenting. Sirens. In the 1930s, Indiana nights were usually marked by crickets and the shuffle of trains in the distance. But for Dillinger and his circle, another sound began to follow them. The rising wail of pursuit carried through the dark. And it was in these nights, where silence gave way to sirens, that the outlaw's myth took its next breath. The first chase came unexpectedly. The circle had finished another small-town robbery, quick and efficient. The car was loaded, the road open. The plan had been clean, the timing near perfect. They had learned to slip away like shadows, leaving towns frightened but unscarred. But that night, as they pushed down a country road, the calm was broken by a sound new to them, the long, keening cry of a sheriff's siren. It was distant at first, like an echo rolling across fields. But the noise grew, carried on the cold air, sharp against the night. Singleton chuckled, tapping the dashboard nervously. Guess the boys found their courage. Carter said nothing, eyes fixed forward, and Dillinger, hands steady on the wheel, did not look back. For the first time, the towns were not just afraid, they were chasing. The sound unsettled more than it threatened. Sirens were primitive then, their wail more haunting than mechanical. To hear one across a dark road was to feel hunted not by men, but by something larger, an alarm that seemed to tear through the night itself. Psychologically, it mattered. For years, Dillinger had carried silence as his ally. Silence had unsettled towns, silenced clerks, and held fear in place. But sirens turned that balance. Silence now belonged to the lawmen, creeping, searching. The sound belonged to the hunted. The chase stretched through winding roads, dust rising behind them. Dillinger drove with a calm that belied the tension. His hands did not tremble. His eyes did not dart. He moved like a man who believed roads bent for him. Behind him, the siren rose and fell, closing distance. Singleton laughed louder now, trying to mask his unease. Carter checked the weapons, though none of them wanted to fight. Fulton sat motionless, staring back through the rear window as though memorizing the rhythm of the sound. The road seemed endless, the night stretching longer with every turn. And then, suddenly it ended. The siren fell away, swallowed by distance. The sheriff's car had faltered or turned back or simply lost a trail. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. This silence carried an aftertaste, the memory of pursuit. Word of the chase traveled fast. Towns that had once whispered of quiet robberies now spoke of lawmen in pursuit, of brave sheriffs, of narrow escapes. The legend grew on both sides. Dillinger became not only the shadow that robbed banks, but the outlaw who outran sirens. Psychologically, these moments shifted something within Dillinger. He had once been invisible, hollow, unnoticed. He had built his name on silence, on control, on fear that spread without sound. But now, with every wail of the siren, his name was becoming something louder. The nation's attention sharpens not on whispers, but on echoes. And sirens created echoes that stretched beyond Indiana's borders. A remembered scene paints the moment clearly. The circle had stopped at a roadside field. The night quiet once more. The car sat cooling, dust still clinging to its wheels. Singleton lit a cigarette, laughing into the dark. Carter muttered about the risks, about towns stiffening in their resolve. Fulton remained silent, eyes still on the horizon. And Dillinger stood a little apart, staring down the road they had just traveled. He did not smile. He did not curse. He simply stood in the cool air, listening as though the siren still lingered in the distance. In that moment, he seemed to understand something the others did not, that silence and sirens would now battle for his life. For small towns, the sound of sirens was a rallying point. It gave them courage. It reminded them that the law still stood, that men in uniform were willing to chase shadows into the night. Children pressed against windows to hear it. Shopkeepers felt a spark of protection when the sound carried through the fields. And yet, each time Dillinger's car slipped away, the sirens lost a measure of power. Fear returned sharper than before. The outlaw was not only silent, he was faster than the sound itself. The sirens, though distant, became part of the outlaw's story. They framed him not as a thief in the dark, but as a hunted man who always found escape. They turned him into theater. Townspeople told the story not only of the robbery, but the wailing chase that followed, of headlights racing through the night, of lawmen failing to catch the ghosts that haunted their roads. In time, the circle learned to expect the sound. They moved with more precision, left more quickly, drove with sharper instinct. Dillinger, at the wheel, began to treat sirens not as threats, but as tests. He seemed to grow calmer with each chase, as though the sound itself had become a companion. But deep inside, there lingered something else, a recognition. Sirens carried distance. They spread stories. They reached ears silence never could. And if silence had built his fear, sirens would build his fame. There's a remembered winter night in southern Indiana. The circle sped along a narrow road, frost clinging to the edges. Behind them, again, came the rising wail. Singleton muttered about bad luck. Carter cursed the timing. Fulton stared blankly back. But Dillinger, hands firm on the wheel, almost seemed to smile, not in joy, but in understanding. He was no longer just a boy lost in the hollow streets of Indianapolis. He was a man carrying both silence and sirens with him, and both, in their way, would make him unforgettable. So the night stretched on, filled with sounds that did not belong to countryside. Sirens called out, silence swallowed them, and somewhere between the two, Dillinger's legend grew. For in those cold nights, fear no longer walked alone. It now had a voice that wailed through fields and echoed through time. The outlaw and the siren were now bound together. Trust, in the world Dillinger built, was always fragile. It was not written into contracts or signed on paper. It was given in a nod, a glance, a shared silence in the back seat of a car. But like frost on a window, trust could vanish the moment the warmth shifted. And for Dillinger, the moment came with something simple, a handshake. By 1933, the circle had grown restless. The roads were longer, the money heavier, and the stories louder. Sirens had turned into headlines, and those headlines carried pressure. Towns were arming themselves. Sheriffs were learning. Even ordinary men whispered about standing watch. Inside the circle, tension brewed. Singleton drank too much and talked too freely. Carter's eyes carried calculation, as if weighing profits against risks. Fulton withdrew deeper into silence, speaking less with every passing day. And Dillinger, though outwardly calm, felt the edges fray. The betrayal began not with words, but with hands. A local contact, known only in memory as Mr. Harlan, had been introduced by Singleton. He was meant to provide safe houses, barns for hiding, supplies for the road. He carried the appearance of loyalty, a farmer's steadiness, a neighbor's smile. When Dillinger met him, the exchange was sealed in a handshake, firm, cold, unremarkable. Yet it left something behind, a lingering chill that clung to memory. Harlan's offer seemed genuine. A barn outside Kokomo, hidden by trees, left unused by neighbors. The circle needed rest. They had moved too quickly, too often, and the law was growing sharper. The barn felt like sanctuary. They parked the car, unloaded bags, and settled into the silence. The night air was cool, the ground still damp from rain. Inside, hay stacked high, shadows long across the rafters. Singleton laughed, saying it was safer than any town they'd seen in weeks. But Dillinger did not laugh. He walked the perimeter twice, his steps measured. He touched the walls, checked the doors, studied the ground. His hands rested on wood that felt too polished, too clean. His eyes lingered on marks in the soil, like tires that did not belong to farm wagons. And when he lay down that night, he kept his eyes open far longer than the others. The betrayal revealed itself in the morning. Fulton woke first, sensing movement outside. Through the cracks in the barn door, headlights glowed in the distance. Cars. More than one. The sound of engines carried across the damp fields. He roused Dillinger without a word. Carter stirred, cursing. Singleton blinked in confusion. And then came the sound they all dreaded. Sirens, not distant this time, but close, too close, rolling across the fields with purpose. The handshake had delivered them into a trap. In memory, the scene plays like slow theater. Carter, scrambling with weapons. Singleton, panicked, muttering about mistakes. Fulton, pale but steady, watching Dillinger for direction. And Dillinger himself, calm again, impossibly calm, as though betrayal was always expected, as though the cold handshake had spoken louder than words. He whispered only once, "We don't run blind." They slipped out through a side door, cutting across the fields. The barn behind them filled with light, headlamps and lanterns, shadows moving, lawmen calling out. Shots cracked, hay scattered. The sound of boots against earth thundered behind them. The circle moved like shadows through the wet grass. The chase was fierce, the lawmen relentless. But the fields, dark and wide, offered cover. Dillinger led them toward a creek, cold water biting at their boots. They waded through, the sound of sirens muffled by rushing current. By the time dawn crept across the horizon, they had vanished once more. The barn stood behind them, full of emptiness, full of failure. But something had shifted. Inside the circle, trust no longer held. Singleton's loyalty was questioned. Why had he trusted Harlan? Carter's greed seemed louder in the silence. Fulton's distance grew heavier. And Dillinger, though outwardly unchanged, carried something colder within him. He had always believed betrayal was inevitable, that silence was safer than words. The handshake had only proven it true. Psychologically, betrayal hardens men. But for Dillinger, it also deepened a paradox. He needed others to move, to drive, to plan, to act. Yet he could not fully trust those same men. His leadership grew sharper, his commands more precise. But beneath the surface, he began to walk alone, even in company. The barn incident spread quickly. Towns whispered not only of robberies, but of traps. Lawmen congratulated themselves on courage, even in failure. For the outlaw, the legend twisted again. He was not only the man who escaped sirens, he was the man who escaped betrayal. Years later, men who remembered him often spoke of this moment, of how Dillinger's eyes grew colder, of how his voice carried less warmth. He had learned the cost of trust, and from that day forward, he gave it sparingly, if at all. The outlaw's path was always lined with silence, but after the barn, that silence grew heavier. There's a remembered image. Dillinger standing apart from the circle, wiping mud from his boots after the escape. The others muttered about plans, safety, revenge, but he simply stood still, eyes fixed on the horizon. In his mind, perhaps, the sound of the handshake still lingered. Cold, brief, inevitable. A handshake that had turned to ice. Courtrooms do not echo like streets. They do not carry the sound of boots on wet pavement or the sudden bark of a revolver. They hold silence differently, heavy control, shaped into ritual. For Dillinger, the courtroom was the one stage he never wanted. And yet there he stood. The walls of the Indiana courtroom were high, wood-paneled, carrying the weight of decades. The air smelled faintly of dust, of ink, of oil from polished benches. Outside, the town gathered in murmurs, pressing against doors and windows to catch even the rumor of his presence. Inside, 12 men sat in judgment. Farmers, clerks, merchants. Ordinary faces, ordinary lives. Yet when their eyes met Dillinger's, they carried something harder than pistols. Their gaze was not curiosity, nor fear, nor admiration. It was glass. Frosted, cold, unreadable. Dillinger had known stares before. The wide-eyed awe of small-town clerks handing over money. The angry glares of sheriffs left humiliated. Even the uncertain, admiring glances of neighbors who whispered his name like a myth. But this was different. These men did not look at him as man or myth. They looked at him as something to be decided. A weight on a scale. A puzzle with only one conclusion. Their silence pressed heavier than any siren. His lawyer whispered strategy. Plead carefully. Speak humbly. Appear small. Appear remorseful. But Dillinger, even seated in the defendant's chair, carried that peculiar calm, the same stillness that had guided him through alleys and barns. The prosecutor spoke of robberies, of stolen money, of frightened tellers and wounded pride. He painted Dillinger not as man, but as storm, a force sweeping across towns, leaving fear where it passed. The jurors did not flinch. Their faces remained frosted glass. Dillinger's turn came. He stood, hands folded, voice even. He spoke of poverty, of opportunity, of desperation born not from cruelty but survival. He spoke of family, of Indiana winters, of choices made in corners where no light reached. His words were measured, his tone respectful, yet he felt the air unmoved. The jury listened, but their eyes never thawed. Psychologically, a courtroom strips away myth. On the street, Dillinger was larger than life, a figure made of whispers and motion. In the courtroom, he was a man in plain clothes, confined by walls, observed like specimen under glass. The tension between those identities was crushing. For the first time, Dillinger felt the strange pressure being reduced. Not an outlaw or leader, but the subject. His legend did not shield him here. It was weighed, measured, and turned into evidence. When the witnesses spoke, their voices wavered with memory. A clerk described the barrel of a gun. A farmer recalled the sudden rush of men into town. Each detail chipped at the air around him, placing stone after stone on a growing pile of judgment. The jury listened, still cold, still unreadable. And Dillinger, though outwardly calm, began to understand a deeper truth. He could run from sirens, from barns, from betrayals. But he could not run from glass. The verdict was not immediate. Deliberation carried into hours. The room emptied into restless silence. Dillinger sat, waiting, staring at the floor, his hands unmoving. His circle, what remained of it, was absent. No voices rose for him here. No allies filled the benches. Only the law, steady and patient, waited. When the jury returned, the air thickened. Every step echoed. Every chair creaked. They sat faces still unreadable, but now carrying decision. The words came formal, practiced, unfeeling. Guilty. The sound was not loud. It was quiet, almost ceremonial, yet it landed heavier than gunfire. Dillinger did not flinch. He nodded once, slow, as though the outcome had been written long before the trial began. His eyes scanned the room, not in anger, but in study. The jurors did not look back. Their eyes remained frosted, glassy, distant. It was not hatred that condemned him, nor outrage. It was something colder, detachment, a decision made by men who did not see him as person, but as necessity. Later, in the stillness of a cell, Dillinger reflected on that moment. The gunfights, the escapes, even betrayals. They had all been personal, driven by flesh and blood. But the jury's eyes had been something else entirely. They had looked through him, as though he were already gone, already erased. That, he realized, was a greater danger than bullets. Legends are shaped in motion, but broken in stillness. For Dillinger, the trial marked a fracture. The myth of the outlaw lived outside those courtroom walls, whispered still in taverns and streets. But inside, beneath the gaze of 12 silent men, he had been reduced to paper, evidence, verdict. It was a transformation he could not ignore. There's a remembered image. Dillinger leaving the courtroom in chains, his expression unreadable. Reporters shouted questions. Townspeople craned their necks to see. But he walked as though in a dream, the echo of frosted eyes still upon him. A man judged not with fire, but with ice. Prisons are built not only of stone and steel. They are built of silence. For John Dillinger, the sound of the cell door closing was not what lingered. It was a lack of sound after. No echo, no final clang stretching down the corridor. Just the dead weight of air settling into place. The first night behind bars is always the heaviest. Outside, towns moved on with their days. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Children played in dirt roads. But inside, time folded into itself. Every hour looked like the one before. Every shadow on the wall repeated endlessly. Dillinger sat on a narrow cot, hands resting on his knees, and listened. He expected noise, chains, shouts, the mutter of other men trapped in cages. But the cell block carried only faint whispers, absorbed quickly by the stone. The silence was thicker than any lock. This silence was not new to him. He had known quiet barns, empty alleys, the stillness after a gunfight when smoke hung in the air. But this silence was different. It was not freedom's quiet. It was confinement's quiet, the kind that pressed inward until even thought felt contained. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, counting cracks in plaster. Each crack was a road he could not take, a street that bent away from him. Psychologically, Dillinger wrestled with the paradox of confinement. On the outside, he had lived by momentum, always moving, always planning the next town, the next bank, the next narrow escape. Motion had been his shield. Here, there was no motion. The stillness was a mirror, reflecting the choices that had led him to this cot, this ceiling, this silence. The outlaw who had sprinted through fields now measured life by footsteps between bed and bars. The man who thrived and risked now faced the endless safety of confinement. And safety, he realized, could be more suffocating than danger. Days became weeks. Routine set in with mechanical precision. Meals slid through slots. Guards walked their patterns. Prisoners filed in and out of work details. Time lost shape. Dillinger adapted outwardly, quiet, observant, compliant. But inwardly he studied. Not escape routes yet, not opportunities. He studied silence itself, how it changed men, how it carved at their edges. He saw strong men collapse under boredom. He saw restless men burn themselves out against walls that would never move. He promised himself he would not be hollowed the same way. At night, when the block settled into uneasy stillness, he thought of his circle. Some were dead, some scattered, some still free. Their laughter, their sudden burst of energy, their reckless promises. These sounds haunted him more than any guard's footsteps. The memory of motion was worse than silence, for it reminded him of what had been taken. There was one sound he clung to, faint but real, the slow rhythm of his own breathing. It became anchor and compass. Proof that he was still here, still present, still alive. The silence tried to erase him, but each breath reclaimed a sliver of space. Psychologists might call it adaptive dissociation, the ability to step outside oneself in order to endure monotony. Dillinger practiced it without knowing the term. He built small rituals, counting breaths, mapping cracks on the wall, imagining the sound of doors opening, footsteps resuming, streets calling again. The rituals kept the silence from swallowing him whole. One evening, as daylight faded through narrow windows, Dillinger stood at the bars and touched the cold iron. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the doors swinging open, but in his mind the sound never came. No clang, no echo, just quiet. That was the truth he carried. The door had closed, and it had closed without echo. No one outside had heard it. The world had moved on. Yet within that truth was also a spark. If the world had not heard the door close, then perhaps the world had not yet finished with John Dillinger. The silence might have caged him, but it had not erased him. Not yet. There is a remembered image. Dillinger pacing the narrow length of his cell, steps measured, eyes sharp, as if rehearsing for a stage no one else could see. Guards noted his calm, his lack of outbursts. They mistook it for acceptance. In reality, it was study. The silence was teaching him. The door without echo had not ended him. It had only given him new ears to hear with, new eyes to see with. In that stillness, Dillinger began to imagine the shape of freedom again. Prison was a world of patterns. A bell rang, a gate opened, a line shuffled, a meal arrived, a silence returned. To most men, these patterns dulled the spirit. To John Dillinger, they became material to shape, like clay pressed into form by patient hands. Morning began with steel striking steel, the rattle of keys, the slam of bolts, the call to rise. Men groaned, some cursed, others moved with resignation. Dillinger rose without a sound. He folded his blanket with military precision, washed quickly at the basin, and stood ready. Routine was not his enemy. Routine was practice. Every repetition made him sharper, not duller. Every measured day was a page to be studied. The prison workshop became his classroom. Rows of men bent over machines, the air thick with oil, sweat, and the faint grind of metal. Dillinger's hands worked steadily, but his mind worked faster. He watched the guards' movements, memorized their rhythm. He noted which bolts were tightened, which doors dragged, which locks clicked differently. He did not daydream. He calculated. Freedom was not a wish. It was an equation. Psychologically, confinement had begun its quiet transformation. Where once his strength had been speed, rushing into towns, striking before defenses could rise. Now his strength was patience. The cell taught him to slow his pulse, to think in hours instead of minutes, in months instead of days. He was still the outlaw who had lived in motion, but now he was also the prisoner who could sit in silence and let time serve him instead of break him. At meals, he listened more than he spoke. Other men grumbled about their sentences, cursed the guards, told half-remembered stories of the outside. Dillinger absorbed it all, storing names, rumors, fragments of plans. In the economy of prison, information was currency, and he saved it like a miser. He gained a reputation, not as the loudest, not as the toughest, but as the one who noticed. Men began to trust him with details, confidences, half-serious dreams of escape. He never betrayed their words, never mocked them. Instead, he filed them away, each a tool for later use. Nights were the hardest. The silence returned, heavy and unrelenting. Dillinger fought it with ritual. He traced the same crack on the ceiling, counted the same steps across his cell, replayed the same imagined escape in his head. Repetition became endurance. Endurance became strength. What broke other men, the weight of time, was what slowly hardened him. Prison psychology texts often describe the prisonization process, the gradual absorption of inmate values, codes, and behaviors. Dillinger experienced this too, but with a difference. He learned the code, but he did not surrender to it. Where others bent to survive, he studied to conquer. He was not consumed by the prison. He was tempered by it, like steel shaped by fire and hammer. Outside, the world was shifting. The Great Depression had carved deep wounds in cities and towns. Banks failed, farms collapsed, families scattered. Law enforcement strained under the weight of desperation and new criminal enterprises. Inside, Dillinger followed these changes through newspapers smuggled in, through whispers carried from new arrivals. Each headline was a reminder. The stage outside was changing, and when the door opened again, he would step into a world both wounded and ready. Still, even the strongest mind wavered. There were nights when he felt the weight of futility pressed down, when he wondered if the silence would win after all, when freedom seemed not a plan but a fading memory. In those hours, he turned again to ritual. He tapped his fingers against the iron bars, 5 times, then 10, then 20. The sound was faint, almost nothing, but it was something, proof that he could still make the silence answer him. Men noticed his discipline. Some mocked it, others admired it. A few were drawn to it, sensing in him not just another prisoner, but a figure with gravity. Slowly, a circle formed, men who looked to him, who whispered with him in the yard, who trusted his quiet certainty. Dillinger was not yet a leader, but prison was already shaping him into one. Every day behind iron bars was another measured day. Every measured day was another lesson. And every lesson was a step not away from freedom but toward it. Dillinger's time inside was not wasted. It was an apprenticeship, not under one mentor, but under the silence itself. The world outside had not yet heard him, but when it did, the silence would not hold him anymore. The end never comes in a single moment. It drifts closer like dusk on a long summer evening. So slow, you barely notice until the light has gone. For John Dillinger, the fading began not with a bullet or betrayal, but with the quiet erosion of certainty. The years on the run had left their marks. His body, once restless and tireless, carried new aches. His eyes, once sharp with mischief, now flickered with caution. The laughter still came, but it carried weight. He had learned what every fugitive eventually learns, that freedom lived in minutes, not years. Every knock on a door, every shadow on the street, every glance too long from a stranger became a reminder. Time was no longer his ally. His circle had shrunk. Friends disappeared, some to prison, others to the grave. Those who remained looked at him differently, not with awe, but with calculation. They measured the risks of standing too close to a man the entire country now knew by name. Isolation seeped in quietly. Even in a crowded room, he felt alone, as though the walls leaned closer, as though every whisper turned against him. Health, too, began to betray him. The years of stress carved themselves into his body. Nights of poor sleep left him worn. The constant strain of escape tightened his chest. He was still young in years, but old in burden. Doctors would have spoken of nerves, of exhaustion, perhaps of ulcers. Dillinger spoke of nothing. He carried it silently, as he always had. Outside, America was shifting again. Prohibition had ended. The old avenues of bootlegging wealth dried up. The Depression still held its grip, but the country's gaze was turning toward recovery. Law enforcement, embarrassed by his past escapes, sharpened its methods. No longer were local sheriffs his main pursuers. Now it was the newly empowered federal agents, armed with jurisdiction and pride, chasing him across state lines. The hunter had become the hunted, and the circle was tightening. In moments of reflection, Dillinger felt the strange weight of his reputation. To the public, he was legend, the man who fooled the banks, who slipped chains, who laughed in the face of authority. To himself, he was still just a boy from Indianapolis who had learned too early how to listen, how to wait, how to strike. The myth was large in the man, and the man could feel it crushing him. There were still moments of warmth. Nights spent in rented rooms with a trusted companion. Conversations where laughter broke through the tension, if only for an hour. Small comforts, meals shared, cigarettes smoked, songs heard on the radio. He clung to these as proof that life was more than the chase. But the season was changing. Summer was slipping into autumn, and autumn carried its own gravity. The psychological strain deepened. Paranoia became less a flaw and more a survival instinct. He checked windows twice, locked doors 3 times, never sat with his back exposed. Yet even in this vigilance, he knew the truth. No amount of caution could outpace fate forever. Betrayal hovered in the air. Every ally might be a shadowed knife. Every smile might be a mask. Trust, once a fragile luxury, became almost impossible. Historians often note how his last months were a paradox. Bold moves paired with quiet desperation. He robbed banks still, but with fewer men. He appeared in public still, but under heavier disguise. He lived as though daring the world to catch him, while secretly knowing it soon would. It was not recklessness. It was acceptance, an unspoken acknowledgement that the dusk had arrived. The season of fading light is cruel because it does not announce itself. It lets a man believe the day is still his. Then, without warning, the last ray vanishes. For John Dillinger, that vanishing point drew closer with every step, though he could not yet name it. He felt it, the way one feels a chill in the evening air, subtle but undeniable. The outlaw who had fooled everyone was beginning to realize he could not fool time. Legends do not end where men fall. They ripple outward, through headlines, through whisper recollections, through the uneasy silence of those who live close enough to feel the tremor. John Dillinger's body may have lain still on a summer night in Chicago, but his story refused to settle. It rose again, etched into America's memory, as sharp as glass and as heavy as stone. The newspapers made certain of that. Morning editions sprawled his name in bold letters, drawing crowds eager to trace the lines of his downfall. Some read with satisfaction, believing justice had found its mark. Others read with regret, convinced the system had forced his hand. Still others read with awe, seeing in him not a criminal, but a symbol, a man who played against impossible odds and, for a time, won. Photographs of his lifeless form, his face lit by the glare of flashbulbs, were passed from hand to hand. The image of the man who had defied banks, police, and federal agents, now reduced to stillness, became a kind of national fascination. America had always loved the spectacle, and Dillinger's end offered one that was equal parts theater and tragedy. But legacy is never simple. For law enforcement, his death became proof of progress. It marked a turning point for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, elevating it from a fledgling agency to a force of national power. His pursuit gave them purpose. His capture gave them credibility. In stone and steel, the architecture of modern policing took shape around the shadow of his name. Yet for others, he lingered as something else entirely. To the poor, to the struggling, to those broken by the Great Depression, he remained a figure who had taken from banks when banks had taken everything from them. He was the echo of defiance in a country where survival felt like rebellion. The psychology of his legacy is telling. Dillinger represented both fear and desire, the fear of unchecked lawlessness and a desire for freedom without restraint. In him, people saw what they wished for and what they dreaded, sometimes in the same breath. He was not the first outlaw America celebrated, and he would not be the last. But he emerged at a moment when the nation needed stories, when the bleakness of empty pockets demanded a character larger than hunger, larger than despair. His robberies became theater. His escapes became folklore. He was, in the public's mind, less man than myth. Time, however, has its own way of reshaping myths. As decades passed, the sharp lines blurred. Movies cast him as romantic, as tragic, as cunning, as doomed. Biographies tried to pin him down. Yet each author found a different Dillinger. The ruthless predator, the loyal son, the reckless youth, the calculating outlaw. He became a mirror, reflecting whatever the storyteller needed. Graveyards, too, hold their own stories. His final resting place, marked by stone, has been visited, disturbed, and even tampered with by those unable to let his legend rest. People chipped at the marker, seeking fragments of history to hold in their hands, as though touching the stone might bring them closer to the man. But perhaps the truest echo lies not in glass photographs or carved markers. It lies in the lingering unease of law and legend intertwined. Dillinger's life posed a question America has never fully answered. What draws us to those who defy the rules, even as we demand those rules be enforced? It is the same paradox that fuels every noir story, every whispered tale told in shadowed rooms. We fear the outlaw, yet we lean closer when his name is spoken. We condemn his choices, yet admire his audacity. We tell ourselves we would never walk his path, yet secretly wonder what it felt like to outpace the world, if only for a little while. In the end, Dillinger's legacy is neither clean nor complete. It rests somewhere between the steel bars he slipped, the glass doors he shattered, the stone markers that bear his name. It rests in the minds of those who, even now, let their thoughts drift to the outlaw who fooled everyone. Not fooled forever, but fooled long enough to remind us that even in the most ordered of societies, shadows will always find a way to move. And in those shadows, the echoes remain quiet, persistent, unforgotten.